Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody for hanging in with this. I love to talk about it. Having spent like 3 years in my little cubby hole learning about it, it really means a lot to me to share it. So thank you. The second thing is, I don't know if people have questions from our last session 2 weeks ago. If you do, I think I'm gonna ask you to hold them until the end. I'm sorry to do that, but I want to get through the content tonight. Is that okay?
Sure. That's fine.
Great. And then the third thing is just keep in mind for, as we go along, about always the 3 things I like to suggest when you're hearing a presentation that can shape your thinking or questions or how to think about this. And that is what confused you, what inspired you, and what challenged you. And so I invite you to have those sort of categories in mind as you think about what questions you may have. Tonight, we're going to be doing 2 things. One is interpreting early Christian art, which is just sort of an overview of early Christian art and what are some big picture ideas about it that guide how we interpret the images that we see in catacomb frescoes and eventually on sarcophagi. And I'm deeply indebted to Robin Jensen, who was a real pioneer in studying Christian art. Her book by the same title is called Interpreting Early Christian Art. And a fair amount of the content for this first part is thanks to her. The other part of the content is thanks to Dr. Janet Tulloch, who's a specialist in early Christian images, who developed, I think, some very innovative tools for how to guide how we analyze images. So the first 3 topics, I'll just give you the 3 headings. The role of art in religion. Then I'm going to talk about the dating of early Christian art. And then we'll move into understanding early Christian art using Robin Jensen's information. And then last, we'll do the analyzing of the visual data, and then a few other interpretive issues and stuff for the first part. So let's see, what time is it? All right, we want to leave a half an hour at the end, right? For sure. Okay, so let's it's just brief, the role of art in religion in antiquity. And it's important to remember that most people in the Roman Empire were not able to read. They were illiterate. I mean, they might be able to read signs and stuff, but they wouldn't be reading scrolls, which weren't that available even if they could read. So a very important way of communicating was through images. And the Roman Empire was terrific at creating coins, paintings, statues that were erected in public spaces all over the empire. As you remember from last week, ancient cities modeled, there were certain 5 things that you see in every ancient city. You see a forum, you see an amphitheater, you see an Odeon. Oftentimes you'll see an Odeon was a music place. You'll see temples, you'll see baths. All of these public spaces would have art all over them. Art of the gods and goddesses, art honoring the emperor. So, and I think another key distinction really between polytheism and Judeo-Christian faith-based kinds of things is that polytheism didn't have written scriptures. So people came to understand who their gods and goddesses were through images. Christianity, on the other hand, was a scripture-based entity because of its roots in Judaism. And so when Christianity became dominant in the empire, the role of art in religion changed. I'm going to quote from Joss Elsner, who is probably one of the preeminent art historians in Roman non-Christian art. And he says, images and myths provided the main forms of theology in the ancient world. And it provided a context for people to think about their gods. But The Christian God, unlike his pagan predecessors, was known not through graven images, but through scripture. And so because of that, nevertheless, art remained important in Christianity because Christians were not particularly literate either, but they learned about their sacred scriptures through homilies and images. So whereas you would have a myriad of gods and goddesses and emperors in the non-Christian Roman tradition, in the Christian Roman tradition, the images would be of figures from scripture. So that's the role of art in religion, and people would gaze on it, and that's how they knew their connection to the divine, the sacred. So let's turn for a moment now to dating, and that is that most early Christian art dates from the late 2nd century into the 4th century, and some in the early 5th century, because it became pretty much all Christian after that. And much of it is found in Rome and surroundings. There are a fair number of sarcophagi that are in major cities all over the world. So all over the empire, like in France and Croatia, and even Constantinople. But as far as images, like frescoes, a lot of that is in Rome because that's where the catacombs are. Now, some of the exceptions, though, that date from the late 2nd century is the, oops, it's not going, there we go. This is a fresco from Dura Europos in modern Syria, which we hope is still there. Well, actually, we don't have to worry too much about it because it's now in Yale. And here is the baptistry that you can see where the image was from. And this is a predominantly Eastern style. And so art historians say because the style and content of the images from the Dura Europos baptistry, and these are Christian images, are very different from the style found in Rome. Therefore, they conclude that Christian art in the East and West arose very independently, with the traditions not influencing one another. Just the thing about Dura Europos, for a long time, this is a Christian baptistry in a small town. There's a Jewish synagogue down the street, also very ancient, and they think that they were competing for women, which is pretty interesting, which is why you have all these images of women in this baptistry. At one time, it was thought to be the first image of Mary of Magdala, but now the thinking is, because you can't see it here, but over along here, there's a bunch of unrelated feet. Now they think it might have been the 10 women with their lamps. So it's unclear, but it's clear that these are the earliest images of women, certainly in the East. Early Christian art is commonly found in funerary settings, and there's little evidence really of it, as I mentioned earlier, until the late second or early 3rd century, and that is identifiably Christian, because the Christians were adapting the images from their surrounding Hellenist culture. So now let's turn to the third thing that I spoke about, how to identify early Christian images from the surrounding culture, and it's not always that easy. And Robin Jensen identifies 4 groupings of early Christian images. The first is borrowings from the pagan religious world that were adapted to serve Christian teachings. And let's see if we can get to that one in a minute. The slide I'd hoped to use for this didn't come through. So anyway, this is a good shepherd. It is a Hellenist image. It's a beautiful, beautiful statue. But this is where the Christian artists got their idea for the Good Shepherd. The second area are sort of religiously neutral images based on traditional decorative motifs. And some of these are fish. This is an anchor with 2 fish that soon became identified. You can see the fish here and here, and became identified as a primary image, symbol of early Christianity. Another one is doves, and you can see the doves up here. And here you can see again the image of the Good Shepherd with 2 sheep. These look very bucolic. They're Hellenist images. There's nothing like, specifically Christian, but these are the images that the earliest Christian art adapted. And then the third grouping, okay, this is like the second grouping. This is from the Catacombs of Doma. It's a front of a sarcophagus. But you can see all of these bucolic images of sheep and shepherds, and then you have a woman with a scroll. Now this is probably a Christian image, but when I was doing my study, I only included in the study images that had specifically biblical characters. But this is very likely one of the transitional art things, but you can't really prove it. So the third major grouping, according to Jensen, in this earliest period, say from the 2nd until the beginning of the 4th century, are what she calls narrative biblically based images, where this is the most obviously Christian because it contains images from both the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. And so in here, this is a 4th century woman's tomb in the Pio Cristiano. You can see with her hands in this speech gesture, she's holding a codex in this case rather than a scroll. But arrayed, this is one of the ones that caught my attention 7 years ago that made me decide we had to write a book and get this out there. Anyway, you can see on either side of her, on this side are scenes from the New Testament. This is Jesus. This is the healing of the paralytic, okay? He sees carrying his little bed. This is the healing of the blind person, and Jesus has his hands over his eyes. This is the wedding of Cana. You can see all the jars down here. And over here is the raising of Lazarus. And down here is Martha or Mary, we don't know who, but often in that position. Now you see Jesus here holding this stick, and here again a stick. The early Romans did not have a category for miracles. They came from a completely different tradition than Christianity's ancestral roots in Judaism. Their category for miracle was a wonder worker or a magician. So they showed Jesus with a wand. I was calling Jesus is Harry Potter here. Anyway, I love that. I think it's really fascinating. And on this side, on our woman's right, you can see Adam and Eve. And this is Cain and Abel bringing the first fruits to God. Now, just another thing to notice that I'm going to point out because it will be important later, but notice how many of these figures is Jesus holding a scroll. Here, he's also, I guess not here, but anyway, here, it was very important to the early Christians to show that their religious heroes were educated and learned. And we will get into that more in the next session, and you'll see this sarcophagus again. But it's Jensen's example of the third type of early, this is really probably after Constantine, because those first three, the first two that I spoke, well, this is sort of, can be transitional because some of these really are early 4th century before 313 when Constantine issued the Edict of Toleration and made Christianity legal. Up until that time, there weren't such a huge demand for these really intricately carved early tombs. But you can see they're biblically based. In the post-Constantinian period, which is from the 2nd quarter of the 4th century to the 6th century, you see the Christian art getting, first of all, much more elaborate and I guess I would say beautifully sculpted. This is a scene from a sarcophagus that's in the Vatican, what do they call it? It's not the Vatican Museums, it's right outside where the original is. A cast of it is in the Pio Cristiano, but In this, you see Jesus in this very elevated position. This is Chalice. Again, this is another example of how Christians develop their art from their Hellenist cultures. Chalice is the god of earth. And you can see Jesus is showing that he's Lord of heaven and earth. And on either side, this is probably Peter, and this is probably Paul. He's got a high forehead. And see, this is Peter because Jesus is giving the scroll or the doctrine to Peter. And so we suddenly get into very more dogmatic images that trying to show a very elevated understanding of Christ, who's sort of taking over as the new emperor, you know. I'm going to show you this too. Notice these two in-facing figures. This is also going to be important later because these are meant to enhance the authority of the central figure. And in fact, this image derived from an earlier Roman image of a magistrate. So again, the Christians modeled their understandings of authority with what was in their surrounding culture. The other thing that happens is that it really isn't until much later that we see the crucifix, because earlier this was just a sign of capital punishment. Yeah, nobody's going to put this on their grave. It was only much later, with the triumph of Christianity, that the cross became a sign of triumph. And so you see the Chi-Rho, which can sometimes show up earlier because it's not so obviously a crucifix. And a Chi-Rho is the P and the X from the Greek words for Christos. And then this is a cross. So those really don't show up until quite a bit later. All right, now let's move on to the next slide, which is, okay. Let's talk about art. This is you don't have to look at the slide just yet, but art and archaeology as sources of information about early Christian women. And I'm not sure I said this last week, but the last time, but I should have. Most of history does rely on literary records authored by men. So discovering reliable historical data about women's lives is not easy. It's further complicated that, as we have seen, Christianity relied heavily on the written word as a primary means of understanding its history. So information about the early church to be gleaned from visual artifacts like frescoes, paintings, sarcophagi, friezes, and material artifacts like jewelry, clothing, or household items, that information has been left almost exclusively to art historians and archaeologists. So you can see right away, very early, there's a split in how we look at history from Christianity. Literary sources in history usually connect historians with the educated people from the upper classes who could read. So when you look at those scrolls and codices, they're written for the more elite person. But whereas the visual images and artifacts provide more of a window into the world of the common people, who are always the majority, actually, but who also use the visual images to help construct their worldview. And so this leads us to the recognition that even though there were very many female patrons in the early church, like Mary of Magdala, Phoebe, Lydia, Domitilla, Olympias, and others, and many of those were literate, we don't see them in our literary sources. So it didn't take feminist scholars very long to recognize that the visual imagery and artifacts could provide important information about women in the early church that would not be available in the literary sources. So when we talk about literary sources, we're talking about all the books and scrolls and ancient writings from Cicero and Philo and others. And then when we're talking about the archaeological stuff, we're talking about this stuff, frescoes on catacombs, etc. So now we'll move into the next part. I want to talk some of the interpretive issues, because up until about 50 years ago, almost all of the artifacts were interpreted by men. So they had their own lens, just like women have our lens when we look at stuff. And one of the places that I think really, really suffered from this was the Oran's figure, which is this woman right here. That was almost and then let's see the next one. Yeah, this is from a famous tomb in Arles, another Oran's woman, and this is someone with their hands in prayer, okay? And almost invariably, anytime this figure showed up, which it's all over everywhere, and the figures are invariably women, they're invariably female. Anytime it showed up, most early interpreters said this was an image of the soul. It was not an image of a real woman, okay? So, and we probably can't criticize them too much, because this image in the Christian tradition derived from the Roman source, which is a muse figure, you know, which was ethereal, you know, but the fact is, real life Christian women adapted this thing to represent themselves in their funerary art, and it's been shown. So anyway, an example of this is Janet Tulloch. This is from the Catacombs of Priscilla. It's a fresco that they call the Cubiculum of the Sacraments, because at one point they thought this was a early Christian Eucharist, and they used to say it's because there's 7 baskets, except of course in this one there's 8 baskets. So we don't know. But what's clear is something special is going on over here. And what exactly we don't know, but we know it's a male figure and a female figure. And this female figure is obviously participating in some ritual action here. She's got her hands up in prayer, but this was always interpreted as a soul, not as a real woman. And so again, any woman's participation in a religious ritual would get lost completely, because it was supposed to be the soul of the deceased, rather than a deceased woman showing herself as leading worship, or jointly leading worship with a male figure. So I just want to quote Elizabeth Clark, who's sort of the grandmother of, and she probably hate that, but she was the pioneer in all things early Christian women when she did her fabulous work about 40 years ago. She talks about the ideology of gender. And she says this ideology obscures the particularity of any given historical woman in favor of an idealized feminine construct. And so, anyway, I already told you about Janet, so okay. Now, here's another, and there are a ton of these Oran's figures, and I have to tell you, this gave me the most trouble. It delayed the book probably by about 8 months, because I had to do an in-depth study of all the Oran's figures on all these tombs, because I had to find out, well, are they really women, or are they souls, or what are they, you know? So I had to, thank God, 2 of the experts in Roman art helped me a lot. Steinberg, Judah Dreskin Weiland, and Janet Huskinson, who are well-known art historians with Roman art, helped me a lot in developing the methodology for determining how you interpret the Oran's figures in the Christian tradition. Anyway, this one, there's no doubt that this central figure was a real live woman, because we've got an inscription on this tomb. This is Marcia Romana Celsa. She was the wife of the prefect in Arles, the council in Arles, which was the highest governmental position in Arles, France. And Arles was a very important Roman outpost. And so this is from the museum in Arles, and as you can see, she is a very prominent person. We won't see her whole thing until the next time, but she's in a prayerful position. At her feet, she's got scrolls, and she has these 2 in-facing figures, okay, that are also meant to emphasize the authority of the deceased. And we'll get into why I'm saying that. This is original work from me. So don't take it. But we'll get into that. Not next time, but the time after. Or maybe next time, I guess, maybe. Okay. So just to say that the Orans figures, when we're analyzing visual data, there are interpretive issues depending on who's looking at the image, okay? And oh, I forgot, here, here's a picture of the muse figures from which the Orans figure derived, and you can see they're all standing. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There are 9 muses. The 10th one is this deceased woman. And muses were the people who inspired early Rome, the arts. They were the poets and the musicians and the people who did drama. So the Orans figure derives from that, according to Janet Husband. Another important piece, and let me see if I've got that image. Oh, I guess I don't. I thought I did. Okay, is that according to Janet Tulloch, it's important for us to understand what were some of the differences between 21st century art and Christian art. And that is that early Christian art was oral, A-U-R-A-L in its representation. So early Christianity didn't emerge in a milieu that had email, social media, television. It was, art was perceived within a cultural atmosphere of social discourse, whether it would be sacred or secular. And it would have drawn the viewer in as a participant in much the same way as someone who overhears an interesting comment is drawn into conversation. So if we're going to analyze early Christian art, or any ancient art really, what are some keys for discovering what this meant to a person at that time? And Robin Jensen identifies 4 important keys to discovering clues in the symbolic message of, for example, a sarcophagus overall decoration. One is the frequency and repetition of certain figures. The second is the details or particularities of their composition. And again, you can see this kind of thing, you see again and again and again. This is a very iconic presentation of the deceased and the 2 in-facing figures, either in an Orans or with scrolls. Just an example how they come to it. What are the compositional patterns? What's the physical setting? Janet Tulloch has another set of things, and this is all in the book. So when we're trying to analyze what this meant to ancient peoples, she says, at what or at whom do the figures look? Is each figure looking at the same thing? And we will apply these at the end of this. I'll show you with the Catacomb of, the fresco of Doma Attila of Petronella and Veneranda. So is each figure looking at the same thing? Do any of the figures look at the viewer? What sort of hand gestures are the figures making? Do the figures hold anything? What is it? Are there inscriptions in or near the scene? How are words used? If there are words, and in frescoes, often there are words painted over the scene. Are they descriptive speech? Are there mythological figures present? Who or what? What time of day is it? How is time represented? And one of the things about time, she makes a distinction between ordinary time and mythical time that's evoked by the art. Ordinary time usually means that when the image was created, all the figures are portrayed as if they are alive and acting in the same time period. This mythical time is a different sequence. In catacomb art, you'll see the deceased figure may be depicted as speaking to a living figure within the image frame, or to an actual living person viewing the image and outside the frame. And I don't know if we can see this so much in this other one. Sorry, thank you. Here's the deceased figure, and who's speaking to her here? This is Christ. So this is mythical time here. And mythical time, she's looking at us, but Christ is sort of speaking to her. So we're being drawn into, okay, what's being said here? What's being proclaimed? And that's just a quick example. Are the figures standing, sitting, reclining? How is motion represented? Relationships between movement and inscriptions? Does speech happen before, during, or after? How is the status of individuals? And the status meaning, if they're holding a scroll, they're a person of status. If they're not, well, not so much, okay? So this is all from Janet Tulloch from a really groundbreaking article she wrote on art and archaeology. And probably one last thing is the notion of visual performance. And that is that like their pagan contemporaries, early Christians would have interacted with catacomb or sarcophagus images within what we call a liminal ritual space. And from this sacred space, they would commune with the departed. And so, anyway, we'll get into that a little bit more the next time. Let's turn now to catacomb frescoes, all right? And this is Women in Catacomb Frescoes. In this part, we're going to talk about the Catacombs of Priscilla, the Catacombs of St. John Euarius with Battaglia, the Catacombs of Doma, Attila, Veneranda, and where we find the fresco Veneranda and Petronella. And this is, again, a different media, obviously, than sarcophagus carvings, yet still some of the same images appear again and again. Some of the same figures from early Christianity, from biblical figures, appear again and again. And so even though the medium is different, the message seems to be somewhat consistent, all right? Now this is from the Fraxiopanus fresco in the Catacombs of Priscilla. It's painted on the back wall. People, actually, if you go to the catacombs, the guidebook will tell you this is an early Christian Eucharist. They base it on these 7 baskets. That has been called into question much more lately because there were so many funerary meals, and there's really no way of really differentiating. You can make a case that it was, because lots of times the funerary meals are a little more lively, shall we say, people getting drunk and stuff. And these tend to be a little bit more subdued, but you know, you really can only tell so much from the picture. So in the next one though, whoops, I'm sorry. I thought we'd get rid of I had these attached to music at one point. Every once in a while, one of the slides shows up. Anyway, this one, early on, they, you know, if you went there, they said they were all men and this was an early Christian Eucharist. Well, in fact, when you look at the art more closely, they're not all men. They are, in fact, probably all women. You can tell by the veil here, the earring here. And this one, Carolyn Osick, I tend to, my guru, tells me she thinks this one may well have been a child because it's got its legs over. This is this couch thing is what we talked about last time, called a stibadium, and it's sort of like a meal couch where people recline, they put their elbow. And so this kid is climbing all over the couch and his mother is giving him the evil eye. So remember when Janet says, pay attention to how's the action going, and you can see people pointing to this. So whatever this is, it's a woman's thing and it's a woman's funerary meal, if it is, or it could be a female Eucharist. I'm not going to rule that out at all, 100%. Whoops, sorry, we'll go to the next one. Whoops, I'm sorry. Here again is remember when we were talking about how ancient art is oral in its presentation? Well, here's another funerary meal. You can see this woman doing a toast. It's hosted by women. These 2 center figures are probably a father and son. And they're saying, mix me peace, or it's a toast. Because you mix water and wine. And so that's why they say, mix me peace. And so it's an oral thing. It's drawing you in and it's inviting you as the viewer to be drawn into this celebration of this funerary banquet of this father and son. And that's what the words are meant to draw you in. Now, just one other side thing, remember when we were talking about how early Christian images, this is it, the Catacombs of Pietrus and Marcellinus. It doesn't have any explicit biblical images, but this isn't a Christian part of the tomb. So, but anyway, you can see the roses, the peacocks, these are all funerary images drawn from the Roman culture. Now we're back at the Catacombs of Priscilla now, and you can see, remember our Fraxiopanus fresco? Well, there it is along the back wall. And I wanted you to get a picture of this space here because it's really important to understand all of the ambiance that would be happening when you went to visit this tomb. Now this was a very, very wealthy family that could afford this kind of a space and all the decorations. These are actually the Magi presenting their gifts to Mary, who's enthroned here. You can't see it too well, but you can see it other places. And there are all these feminine biblical stories along the side. Some of them are mysterious. Some think this is Susanna with the elders. Others think this one over here is Mary of Magdala from the tomb, but it doesn't really add up so well biblically as I talk about in the book. I think it's probably Thecla from the Acts of Paul and Thecla. Anyway, you can read more about that in the book. The main thing I want to point out, though, is this is a space where I agree with Nicola Denzi. This could very well have been a space where women gathered to worship within the catacomb or to reflect on their deceased or whatever, because there's places to sit. It's quite a large space.
Wow.
And here we are in the same catacomb, a future church, one of our pilgrimages, which I think we're going to do again next March.
We're talking about March, but I want to talk to you because we might want to do it in June because some teachers want to bring their students.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Do it in the summer.
That'd be great. Anyway, this is one of our pilgrimages, and this is in the Cryptoporticus, that they call it, this catacomb, and we had a bread-breaking Christian ritual here. And so, people come and have, priests come and celebrate Eucharist here. It's a place where they often remember Eucharist. The thing I love about the Catacombs of Priscilla is that there is some historic evidence that links the possibility that the biblical Prisca with her husband Attila could well have been buried there in the 1st century. There is an expert, Orazio Marucci, who reports that their bones were interred at the Priscilla catacomb until the 9th century when they were moved. And so it would not be beyond the, now again, please know that would have been just a small part of the whole tomb. What we know is that the original Priscilla was her ancestral grounds. It wasn't Prisca and Attila. It was a wealthy, Priscilla was a very, very common name. And so it was on the grounds of this wealthy Attila family. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it's Priscilla's family that opened space on her grounds for burying Christians. And it was, but from very early on, Christians are known for venerating Paul's bones near St. Paul's outside the walls from the 1st century, and Peter's also. And there's pretty good archaeological evidence that those areas were venerated by early Christians. So it's not outside the realm that Prisca could have been venerated to. All right, so this is probably, whoops, okay. Yeah, there we go. This is probably the most famous image from the Catacombs of Priscilla. It's in the Battaglia Chapel. It shows a 3 scenes. This dates very late in the 3rd century, so it's very early. One thing I also forgot to say is that the Priscilla site is among the earliest Christian images of any of the catacombs, the other one being Callistus and Praetextatus. But only the Priscilla catacombs has extensive frescoes related to women. And this is one of the most famous ones. And you can see there are 3 vignettes here. The central is a female Oran's figure. On the right is some scene with a male seated in a chair, which is very unusual, with a woman with some kind of special garment. He's got his hand on her shoulder, and a male figure here in the back. And over here on the right is another female figure with in a chair in garb that is very similar to this male figure who's an authority figure. If you're sitting in a chair, you're an authority figure. And he's iconically got curly hair and a beard, very reminiscent of Peter. Okay, now this is again late 3rd century. For many in the early interpretations were saying that this woman was a female deacon. And if anybody saw the movie The Radical Grace, that's how I interpreted it also, because some experts were saying it was a female deacon. But since I did the book, I found out there weren't any female deacons in Rome until the 5th century. So this is early 3rd century. This could not have been a deacon, okay? And they based it on the chasuble image, which is very thin grounds, because that's just sort of what, not chasuble, a dalmatic image, I'm sorry. But that's very thin grounds, because that's just what people wore in those days, you know? So if you go to the catacomb, they'll tell you that this were 3 stages from the woman's life. This is her marriage, this is her motherhood, and this is her in glory, okay? Now there's some problems with that, not least being that the marriage scene doesn't add up, because this is what a typical Roman marriage would have looked like. This is Juno, okay? So admittedly, a Christian marriage will look different, but images of Christian marriages are in the same exact joining of the right hand with scrolls here at the bottom. So this doesn't really add up as being a marriage. Dorothy Urban, who's sort of a speculative archaeologist with she's a doctorate from Tübingen University. She thinks that this is a woman being ordained as a priest because this male figure, Peter, or bishop figure, has his hand on the woman. It's a chasuble. This is the deacon. She's holding the scroll. And this, Dr. Urban thinks, could be Mary looking on approvingly. Okay, I have problems with this. I don't think you can really, you should know my bias from the beginning. I don't think you can specify what order or what office a person is being inducted to solely on the basis of the art. That there were female with title, presbyter and diakonos, that's unquestioned, because we see it again in inscriptions and in literary records. But so Dr. Janet Tulloch says, you know, you really can't tell what, she thinks that there's some kind of special church office happening here, but you can't say what. Okay, now here's my new creative research.
Good.
And it's based on Ruth Eason's groundbreaking work talking about an engraving to the widow Flavia Arcas, that is in the same catacomb. I think that this is a woman being inducted into the order of widows, if I was going to interpret it. And here's why. We have found recently that there are a number of, and it has to do with the word sadist, okay? And there have been inscriptions. Eisen cites Louis Duchesne and Carl Kaufman, who recognized the inscription of the widow Flavia Arcas as the oldest evidence for an enrolled widow. And here's what the inscription says. For the well-deserving Regina, her daughter has placed this stone, the mother Regina, the widow, who sat as a widow for 60 years and was not a burden to the church. Una Virus, she never remarried, who lived 80 years, 5 months, and 26 days. And yet another inscription from Ferentino testifies that an enrolled widow exercised her office at a basilica and had her seat of honor there. So the word satis, which is seat, appears to be associated not only with the office of the bishop, but also with other offices in the early church, including presbyters, elders, and enrolled widows. And this is something we don't have in the church today. But the widow was a very important official in the early church. And if you read the 2nd chapter, a lot of energy was expended by men in the early church trying to control them, okay? Because don't think widow, poor, you know, the men of the church have to support them. No, think wealthy widow, inherited money, husband, father, supporting the church and supporting with other poor widows, but also orphans, okay? Now, the other reason I think that we are on good grounds for this is because, I don't know if you remember the last time, but we talked about Grapte, who was one of 2 people that when the shepherd of Hermas had a vision, he was told to write the vision down and take one to Clement and one to Grapte. Well, Grapte was placed over all of the widows and orphans in Rome. She would have been well remembered by the end of the 3rd century because the Shepherd of Hermas was an early 2nd century book, but the church's memory for these kinds of things is long. She would have remembered particularly probably by the women whose tomb this is. And so lest we think that this means this could have been her child, whoever's tomb this was, it could have been, but it could have also been an orphan. And so this image of this woman right here who has the same status as this person, this male figure over here, the same dressing, also seated on a chair holding an infant, could have been a widow with symbolizing the care for an orphan. So that's my creative new addition to how we might interpret this tomb. And sometimes you sort of have to get back into the mindset of what were the Christians in the 3rd century, what they have remembered. Anyway, it's a really beautiful image. Okay, we'll move on to then, whoops, here we go again. Battaglia Inpachi, this is from the Catacombs of St. Januarius. It dates to the 4th or 5th century. It tells, and again, part of the reason we know of the dating is because this is a different scene. This woman is standing. There seems to be an altar of some sort here. She is in an orange position, a prayer position, and what's interesting here, she has these 2 volumes up above, inscribed with Johannes, Marcus, Matthias, and this is probably Luke, but you can't tell. So clearly she's a woman of the word at the very least. Some have interpreted it since she's standing. Some people see a cup and a plate here. I'm not so sure I do. I can't really see it. I can't say for certain. I tend to be very conservative when it comes to interpreting images. I worked too long as a nurse midwife in science to not have, I want really tight criteria. It's okay if others don't, it's just, this is how I do it. In any case, whether she was a woman presiding at the altar or not, we don't know. What we can say though, there was ample evidence of other women presbyters. We can talk about Lita, the presbyter from Calabria in the late 5th century. There was an inscription, sacred to her good memory, Lita the presbyter lived 40 years, 8 months, 9 days. Her husband set up this tomb. People used to say, oh, well, she's a presbyter, that's only because her husband was a priest, but she's not. But in fact, Lita's husband has no title. So that just doesn't happen, you know, it just wasn't. Another one, of course, is Kale, the presbyter. Thank you. Here lies Kale, the presbyter, who lived 50 years irreproachably. She ended life on the 14th of December. This is, thank Dr. Urban supplied this inscription. And So again, we have lots of inscriptional evidence of women who with the titles of presbyter. So it's, but again, with Battaglia, the evidence would be based not on the art, but on the corresponding data from the literary record. So this says Battaglia Inpachi. So it's not impossible, but you really can't say from the art alone. The last piece I would say about this, that we also, aside from inscriptions, we have a letter from the Pope Gelasius, who's really upset, and he's writing to the bishops in the south of Italy, telling them that things have come to such a low estate that you're even allowing women to preside at the altars. So we've got ample evidence that there were women with the title presbyter who were performing priestly functions as those were understood at the time in the late 4th, early 5th century. Okay. All right. I know you don't want the serenade. This is, to me, one of the most beautiful frescoes in all of early Christian art. It's from the Catacombs of Doma. It's Veneranda and Petronilla. Most scholars in Veneranda, right here is the inscription meaning she who is to be venerated. And this says Petronilla Martyr, okay? And the thing to notice is that these women are dressed in garb from 2 separate historical periods. Veneranda is probably late 4th, 5th century, judging from how wide these sleeves are. She's veiled. Petronilla is dressed in garb more consistent with the late 1st, 2nd century. No veil, hairstyle, she's got a stola, okay? So just from looking at the art and the garb, there's something being communicated here. And since it's Veneranda's grave, certainly she admires Petronilla. Now, so there's a lot of interesting things about this that you can read about in the book, but it looks like the Domitilla burial grounds were part of the estate of a woman named Flavia Domitilla, whose memory dates to the early 1st century. And although there were many women named Domitilla in the Flavius family, an early historian, Dio Cassius, tells us that the 1st century wife of one Flavius Clemens was exiled after her husband was executed for Judaizing, quote unquote. And many believe this accusation reflects early Christian proselytism in Rome, since the 1st century Roman understanding of Christianity was intimately linked to its Jewish origins. So Domitilla was one of many female patrons who donated their ancestral lands to the burial of Christians who could not otherwise afford it. Now, this is not Veneranda. Veneranda could really afford this tomb because most people believe she's buried very close to the grave of Petronilla, which is yet to be found. Now, if you read the book, there's a long, convoluted explanation of how everything figured this out. We don't know. They haven't found the grave of Petronilla. There's a lot of uncertainty there. But what we do know is that Petronilla's name does not appear in the 4th century Roman calendar of martyrs' feasts. And the Catholic Encyclopedia says this supports a late 1st or early century dating of Petronilla's martyrdom because no martyrs prior to the 3rd century were included in this depositio except for Peter and Paul. All 3, though, Petronilla and Veneranda and Nereus and Achilles, they're part of this tomb is part of a basilica that was built by Pope Damasus that originally honored 3 people, the 2 Roman soldiers who were martyred, Nereus and Achilles, and Petronilla. But Damasus, when you get to the end of the book, went through all these Roman catacomb sites where pilgrims were coming to venerate the early martyrs, and he got rid of the women and raised up the men. So just that's sort of a big picture takeaway. And so that's what happened to Petronilla. She was no longer venerated. But here's Nicola Benzi's wonderful thesis, and I think that she's probably right. Petronilla's absence from the church's official sanctioned list of martyrs in the 1st century, says Denzi, reveals a fundamental disconnection between who people actually venerated and those whom Rome's bishops advocated venerating. And part of this may have been gendered. So Denzi says that Petronilla, the Veneranda painting suggests that even in 354, the memory traditions of unrecognized martyrs such as Petronilla still lay in the hands of women. And you see this a lot, actually. There's some people who believe the passion narratives really came from early oral traditions among women who were there for Jesus' death era. So even though they don't appear in the literary record, the women's memory of their own oral traditions shows up. Just one last but still important thing. When you're looking at this, okay, aside from all of the who was Petronilla and where was she, et cetera, you can learn a lot from the art about how this, because Veneranda commissioned this art. She had this art because she wanted to tell about who she was and what was important. She or her family wanted to tell who she was and what was important to her. And so you have these two women from two different historical periods, and then you have, what are these? Well, this is a codex, which came in much more in the 4th century or so, which is a book which was much easier to negotiate than, this is a basket called a capsa, and it carries scrolls. So in the early Christian tradition, we didn't really have a New Testament so much. It was just developing. We had letters from Paul, and we had some early writings, and we certainly had all the Hebrew scriptures, which were written on scrolls. And so the early missionaries carried these scriptures in this basket, and this is a shoulder strap, okay? So Petronilla was likely an early female evangelist who at some point was martyred, but she's being depicted here as another woman of the word who carried scripture scrolls, and these are a sign of her authority, okay? Veneranda, from much later period, depicts herself as being shown with this codices. Now, if you think I'm kidding about this capsa being a sign of authority, and the next one, you see Paul. This is right down the corner and around the street and down the corner from Veneranda. And we know it's Paul because he's got this high forehead and this pointed beard. He's holding the scroll. And what does he have here? A capsa. And so when you read the guidebook, it says, you know, a sign of the doctrine. Here's Paul holding the sign of the doctrine, you know, and with his capsa. We don't hear that so much about good old Petronilla. Instead, what we have in the guidebook is this is Petronilla leading Veneranda into paradise. And they say paradise is depicted by these roses over here, okay? Now this is where Janet Tulloch's guidelines for how to interpret early Christian art come in handy. Because what do we notice? Well, the action here between the two figures is not leaning toward over here where the roses are. What do we have? We have Veneranda gazing at the capsa. We have Petronilla looking at Veneranda and pointing to the scrolls, okay? Mm-hmm. So the whole dynamic of this art is gaze toward the Word of God. Mm-hmm. What is the Word of God and what is important, you know? So I think that's why it's good to have multiple lenses looking at this art, because women will notice stuff that men won't. And men will notice stuff that women won't. But this is why it's so good now that we have both men and women looking at this art. Just one last summary about catacomb portraits and female authority. And that is in the Catacombs of Priscilla, the Battaglia fresco, we see a woman artistically portrayed as equal to the male authority. Judging from the chairs, the cathedra, you know, like if you go to the cathedral where the bishop is, it comes from the word chair, cathedra. So the deceased is probably an enrolled widow, but her authoritative status is iconically portrayed by sitting in the chair, and she's about the same size, etc. So that's one. In the same catacomb, the Fraxiopanus fresco depicts a woman hosting or presiding at a largely female funerary meal. In the Battaglia Inpachi fresco, we see a woman is portrayed exercising biblical authority to teach and perhaps preside at the altar if corresponding literary sources are considered. And at the Catacombs of Doma, Attila, a late 4th century woman, Veneranda, commissioned a funerary fresco to portray her biblical authority as a woman of the word in line with that of Petronella, her foremother in faith. And so, although the study of Christian catacomb portraits has just really begun, in my view, the preceding analyses suggest that early Christian women were memorialized as learned in scripture and exercising ecclesial authority. So that's it. Nothing like a ride through early Christian art. So,
Chris, I wanted to start with a question very quickly. The Battaglia Inpachi. So to me, it looks like an altar, but what else could it be? What else is it? What else could it be representing? Is that? I mean, she's like over something. I mean, is that typical of any other way that women are presented?
Well, by the early 5th century, worship has moved in more into a larger space, a basilica space. So it's just hard. I don't know enough about furniture in the early 5th century.
Yeah.
Certainly it evokes that,
you know,
so that's a good question, Deb.
Yeah. Okay. Other questions?
There's
someone.
Yeah, okay. Hey, Paula.
Hi, Paula.
Am I unmuted?
Yeah.
You are unmuted.
I am unmuted. Could you talk a little bit more about an enrolled widow?
Sure.
What exactly did that mean?
Yeah. Basically, it meant that she was given an official role in the church. And there were rituals and orders, prayers that were said when someone was inducted in the church. Very often the widows were in charge of helping feed and clothe orphans or other widows. Sometimes they baptized women. There was a lot of struggle in the East. And some think actually that the diaconate, the female deacons, came in to diminish the authority of the widows. So the widows were pretty powerful kind of people. So, if we had continued, now we have bishops, deacons, priests. We would have bishops, widows, priests, and deacons, because the widows sometimes, they also had this very ritualized order in which they sat when they came to worship. And the widows sat right up in front, right after the bishop, many times, in some instances. Now, again, it's not monolithic. Different parts of the empire had different ideas about what the roles were but widows were very powerful in Rome. And part of the reason we know this is a big fight between Hippolytus and Callistus. Callistus was one of the early popes, and he was not of the same social status as Hippolytus. And the Christian women, many of them were of higher social status. They wanted to marry, but it was against the culture to marry a man of lower status. So there's this big argument in the church. Callistus said, yes, they should be allowed to marry. Hippolytus didn't agree. And he left. He started his own separate group. And so it was and part of the reason was he didn't agree that, and so in Hippolytus, in the apostolic tradition, we have the very first proscription of women's ordination, and what it says, do not ordain the widows, which you can be damn sure somebody was ordaining them, or he wouldn't have needed a rule to say don't ordain them.
Wow.
So there is some question about whether that Hippolytus was the same as the Roman Hippolytus, but and that's all debated by scholars. But so they were very important. They had very official, prominent roles, and again, they had the money in many cases. That was the deal. Does that help?
So then, where do the presbyters fit in?
Well, the presbyters, that's the ancient, it's just a word for elder, you know, an elder in the church. It didn't get to be priests until about mid-4th, you know, later in Christian tradition. So they were the elders. And usually really up until about the 4th, mid or early 5th century, the deacons had more power than the presbyters. So they were just the elders that you would consult about decisions in the community. And they were always only dealing with that community, which is, you know, really wasn't until the 14th century that priests went someplace besides the community that called them to be priests. So really for the first half of our history, the elder was called from the community and served the community, and only that community. He didn't move to Toledo to take over the, you know, to serve the community in Toledo. So orders didn't become portable until much later. But in the early church, it was, and then even bishops came from the word overseer, episkopos, and they came to be the primary authority, and that was an earlier development. Certainly, Ignatius of Antioch and some of those guys were the main leader of Antioch. And so it's sort of bishops, deacons, and then priests. So I don't know all the details about that. Those are broad brushes.
Okay. So,
Okay. Do you have another one, Paula?
yeah,
Okay.
I need the box around me. Oh, there we go. So
Okay.
a widow could be a presbyter. A married woman could be a presbyter.
No, well,
Anybody could be a presbyter.
yeah. Well, we don't, as far, at least from the inscription evidence. Now we have like a whole other set of orders, church orders, telling women to be silent in the churches. You have a lot of things from the Synod of Laodicea saying women shall not preside at the altars. So we know that women were doing that because they're telling them not to, but it seems that from the 2nd century onward, the late 1st, 2nd century, the mainstream church was resisting the leadership of women. And so, you know, we know that some women had the title, but there was a lot of, the main church was closing out women with authority, or women with orders, or it wasn't even orders actually, that's an anachronistic term because that really didn't come in until the 14th century either. But they were resisting women's leadership in the assembly because they were being told women should be silent in the churches. But see, widow was a different order from presbyter, was a different entity from deacon, was a different entity from, so I think that's what I'm trying to say, at least by the 3rd century, 3rd and 4th century. And again, it was very different in the East and West. There weren't any women deacons in the West until like the 5th century. So it was very diverse. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Other questions?
Catherine, you're unmuted.
Well, this order of widows fascinates me as a widow. I wondered when it was dissolved and why, and was there a special like ritual or ordination for the widows so that they took certain vows? Because it seems that this is something we could restore in our church. I noticed last Sunday, the entire service was led by widows. And this is very interesting to me. So when did it leave and why?
It varies from one part of the empire to the other, but I think by the 5th century, it was pretty much gone. Yeah, and it was mostly because the male churchmen were trying to, they brought up women deacons to try to diminish the authority of the widows. If you look at the second part of chapter 2, under the apostolic tradition and apostolic constitutions and the Testamentum Domini, I trace exactly what was happening in terms of trying to control the authority of women.
Great, thanks.
Sure. It really had to do with money. Bottom line. The widows had the bucks. But see, part of the thing is, the whole thing about patronage, by the end of the 4th century, most of that had gone over to the bishops, and women were giving copious amounts of money. Olympias and Asia Minor, Constantinople she probably funded every bishop in Asia Minor, and it was out of devotion for the church, So it's sort of like women are our own worst enemies in some ways, but it was also a cultural reality. Fran, did you have anything? One of our wonderful volunteers is here.
Yeah.
Fran.
Yes, as you described the things that are known through art and literature, I also was thinking of the commoner people and the fact that Christianity started having gatherings and services only in their house churches because there was nothing else available. And from the Jewish tradition, the woman really does preside within.
Can people hear?
That's what I can.
Okay.
Within the seders and within
Right.
all of those, the woman is really the good one. So from that tradition, that did give women some tradition of power, that they were presiders and they would, especially I think if they were literate and they could actually read and proclaim, that I know that was
Yeah.
lost later. And was it lost in the tradition when house churches no longer serve?
Yeah, I think that it wasn't only Judaism where women's authority was respected within the household. It was also within the Roman culture because the women usually ran the household, and don't think nuclear household, think small business. They would manage the sheep and the shearing and the spinning and whatever, and certainly among the elites, while their husbands were out with Caesar dividing Gaul into 3 parts, the women were running things at home. And so women's authority, and plus, especially in Roman worship, non-Christian worship, women would do the ritual prayers to the household gods all the time. In every family, and it was really their ancestors that they prayed to, what they call their manes, M-A-N-E-S. And the women would lead that worship. So it was only when Christianity moved into a public space, a worship space, that it violated the honor-shame norms of Roman culture, that a woman should not speak publicly. So once you were in the public space, that's really increased it really diminished the ability of women to participate in leading the assembly. But there are places that they still did,
Oh, we see that.
so, but somewhat isolated. It wasn't as mainstream, it appears to.